Big Shaq's mom stepped into the store with grace, but the staff only saw someone unworthy. They dismissed her, humiliated her, sent her to the clearance section, until a customer exposed the truth and turned the entire store upside down. Now, the world is about to see what happens when you underestimate the mother of a legend. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. Shaquille O'Neal had everything a man could ask for: money, fame, success. But none of it changed who he was at his core. He was still the same kid from Newark, raised by a mother who taught him that wealth didn't define a man. His heart did. Even now, as one of the most recognizable figures in the world, Shaq made sure to live by those lessons. And every morning, before the business meetings, before the endorsements, before the world pulled him in a dozen different directions, he took time to do what truly mattered. The morning sun cast a soft glow over Atlanta, its golden light bouncing off the sleek hood of Shaq's black SUV as he pulled into the parking lot of a small breakfast diner on the west side of the city. The place wasn't fancy. Worn-out booths, a handwritten menu on the wall, the smell of bacon and fresh biscuits in the air. But that's exactly why Shaq loved it. As soon as he stepped inside, heads turned. Not because he was Shaquille O'Neal, the NBA legend, but because he was Big Shaq, the guy who made people feel like family the second he walked into a room. "Look who finally decided to wake up," shouted Henry, the diner's owner, a man in his late 50s with a round belly and a thick southern drawl. Shaq grinned, squeezing into a booth that barely fit his frame. "Ain't my fault y'all opened too early." Laughter rippled through the diner. This was his routine: a simple breakfast, small conversations with regular folks, and, most importantly, finding someone to help. It was a quiet act. Unannounced. No cameras, no press. Maybe it was a struggling college student at the next table whose bill he covered. Maybe it was a single mom serving coffee who found an extra $500 in tips when she cleaned the table. Shaq never made a big deal out of it. He didn't need to. That was just who he was. But for all the kindness he showed the world, there was one person he owed everything to: Lucille O'Neal, his mother, his rock. She had raised him with strict discipline and endless love, teaching him that respect was earned not through money, but through character. Lucille O'Neal wasn't loud, but she didn't have to be. She carried herself with dignity, the kind of woman who walked into a room and commanded respect without saying a word. Even now, at her age, she was elegant in the way she moved, the way she spoke, the way she handled the world with quiet strength. But Shaq also knew she had seen too much, lived through too many moments where she had to bite her tongue instead of demand justice. Because the world wasn't always kind to women like her, especially when they didn't know who she was. That afternoon, Shaq met Lucille for lunch at her favorite cafe, a small upscale spot tucked away in the nicer part of town. As soon as he walked in, he spotted her sitting by the window, sipping tea, dressed in a simple yet elegant brown coat, her jewelry understated but tasteful. She smiled when she saw him. "Finally decided to visit your old mother?" she teased. Shaq leaned down and kissed her cheek. "You act like I don't call you every single day." Lucille laughed, shaking her head. "Calling ain't the same as visiting." A waitress approached, a young woman who looked nervous, her eyes flicking between Shaq and Lucille. Shaq caught it instantly: the hesitation, the way her hands stiffened slightly as she took their order. He had seen it before. People who didn't expect black wealth. People who saw his mother, dressed in class but without the designer labels, and assumed she wasn't supposed to be in places like this. He waited, gave the waitress a chance to prove him wrong. She didn't. Lucille, as always, handled it with grace, pretending not to notice the way her tea arrived later than the other tables, the way the woman barely spoke to her. Shaq saw it all. He let it go, for now. But it never sat right with him. Even with all his money, all his status, people still looked at his mother and made assumptions, still found ways to remind them that respect wasn't given. It had to be taken. Later that evening, Shaq walked Lucille to her car, their arms linked. "You need anything?" he asked. "New car? Bigger house?" Lucille scoffed, shaking her head. "I got everything I need." Shaq chuckled. "What about that fancy couch you said you wanted? The one with the reclining seats?" Lucille sighed, amused. I don't need all that. Yeah, but do you want it? Lucille hesitated. Shaq grinned. He had her. I might go look at some furniture tomorrow, she admitted. Just to see. Shaq nodded. Good. Go get whatever you want, Ma. You deserve it. Lucille smiled, but there was something else in her eyes, something she wasn't saying. She had spent her whole life being careful, being quiet, choosing dignity over confrontation. But Shaq? Shaq had the luxury of making the world listen. And soon, the world would be forced to listen again. Because tomorrow, Lucille O'Neal was going shopping. And before the day was over, someone was going to regret underestimating her. Lucille O'Neal had never been the type to ask for more than she needed, but today, she allowed herself a small indulgence. She had been eyeing a luxurious sectional sofa for weeks, one with soft leather, deep cushions, and an automatic recliner. It wasn't that she couldn't afford it. She could. Easily. But years of living modestly, of making every dollar stretch, of being careful in spaces where she was always being watched, made her hesitate. Shaq had insisted. Get what you want, Ma. Not what you think you should settle for. So today, she was going to do just that. She pulled into the parking lot of Worthington Furniture, a high-end showroom tucked into one of Atlanta's wealthiest districts. The kind of place that didn't bother advertising sales because their customers never asked for prices. Lucille stepped out of her car, adjusting the belt of her chocolate brown coat, her posture upright, poised. She didn't need to prove she belonged here. She knew her worth. But as she walked through the gleaming glass doors, she felt it almost immediately. The shift in the air. Worthington Furniture was designed to impress the elite. Soft classical music played overhead. The scent of freshly polished wood and expensive upholstery filled the air. The lighting was warm, inviting, highlighting the pristine showroom where furniture wasn't just displayed. It was curated like pieces of art. Lucille took a slow breath, taking it all in. Then she noticed it. Or rather, them. Two salespeople near the counter, a young blonde woman and an older man in a tailored vest, watching her. Not with curiosity, with calculation. Lucille kept walking, pretending she didn't notice. But she did. She noticed how their conversation slowed, how their gazes flicked to each other as if exchanging silent words. Then, just like that, they looked away, dismissed her, as if she wasn't the kind of customer who belonged in a place like this. Lucille had spent a lifetime recognizing moments like this. It wasn't always obvious. It wasn't always outright hostility. Sometimes it was just a second too long of a glance, a polite but cold smile, the way people seemed to relax when they realized you weren't here to stay. She didn't react. She never did. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and walked deeper into the showroom. If they thought she didn't belong, they were about to be very disappointed. She wandered through the store, trailing her fingers over plush fabric and hand-stitched leather, admiring the craftsmanship. It wasn't until she reached the luxury section that the real test began. Lucille stopped in front of a cream-colored sectional, exactly the kind she had in mind. She pressed a hand against the armrest, testing the softness, imagining how it would fit in her home. Can I help you? Lucille turned. A tall woman in a gray designer suit with perfectly pinned blonde hair and a cool, rehearsed smile approached, Victoria Lennox, the store manager. Lucille had met plenty of women like her before. She was the type who didn't need to say what she was thinking. Her tone did it for her. Lucille smiled politely. I'm just looking. Victoria's eyes flicked over her, taking in her outfit, her simple gold jewelry. The smile stayed, but something about it changed. More polite, less sincere. I see, Victoria said, clasping her hands. Well, if you're looking for something affordable, we have a lovely clearance section toward the back. Lucille's fingers stilled on the armrest. There it was, the assumption. That she wasn't here to buy. She was here to browse. That she couldn't possibly afford this kind of furniture. Lucille kept her expression smooth, but inside something tightened. She glanced toward the front of the store, where a well-dressed white couple was speaking with a salesperson. They hadn't been steered toward the back. They weren't being offered clearance options. Lucille turned back to Victoria, her smile never wavering. Actually, I'd like to see the high-end sectionals, the ones with reclining seats. Victoria's brows lifted, just a fraction, a tiny flicker of surprise before she caught herself. Of course, she said, her voice airy, professional. Right this way. But as she led Lucille deeper into the showroom, her posture stiffened. She was already waiting for the moment this customer would back out, and Lucille knew it. The sectional was perfect. Soft leather, deep cushions, an automatic recliner that moved with a whisper instead of a clunky mechanism. Lucille ran her fingers over the fabric, impressed. Then she turned to Victoria. I'll take it. Victoria blinked. A second of hesitation. Then, the mask slipped back into place. Are you aware that this piece starts at $9,800? She asked, her voice light, carefully measured. And that's before tax and delivery fees. Lucille's expression didn't change. She had seen this tactic before. The slow, deliberate listing of prices, the emphasis on cost, a subtle but clear test to see if she would back down. Lucille didn't blink. That won't be a problem, she said simply. Victoria's smile tightened. Very well, she said. We'll just need to run a quick pre-approval for financing. Lucille's eyebrows lifted. Who said anything about financing? Victoria froze for half a second. It was subtle, barely noticeable. But Lucille saw it. I'll be paying in full, she said. Today. A slow shift passed through Victoria's expression, not embarrassment, annoyance. Lucille wasn't playing the role she had expected. She wasn't backing down. She wasn't explaining herself. She was just existing in a space Victoria didn't want her in. And that was unacceptable. Victoria exhaled through her nose, smoothing her suit jacket. I'm afraid we don't have this piece in stock at the moment, she said, her voice clipped. And our next shipment isn't for another 3 months. Lucille studied her. She had barely looked at the inventory system before saying that. She was lying. Lucille let the silence stretch. She wasn't going to argue. She wasn't going to beg. She was going to do what she had done her entire life. She was going to walk away with dignity. Lucille took a step back, straightening. Thank you for your time. Then she turned and walked toward the exit, her posture as poised as it had been when she entered. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her anger. She would not give them the power to ruin her day. She would not let them take anything from her. Not today. But just as she reached the door, she heard a voice behind her. A man's voice. Calm, but firm. I saw everything. Lucille turned. Standing near the counter, watching it all unfold, was a man in his mid-40s, dressed in an expensive navy suit. His expression was unreadable. But the way he looked at Victoria, like he was about to ruin her whole career. And suddenly, Lucille knew. This wasn't over. Not even close. Lucille O'Neal had spent a lifetime choosing dignity over confrontation. She had learned that the world was not always kind to women like her, black, elegant, successful, without needing to prove it. She had also learned that when people didn't know who you were, they assumed the worst. And today, inside Worthington Furniture, she was watching that lesson unfold in real time. The cream-colored sectional was exactly what she wanted. Soft, premium leather. A reclining feature so smooth it barely made a sound. The kind of piece that made a house feel like a home. Lucille had already decided. She was buying it. But the moment she turned toward the nearest salesperson, she felt it coming. The familiar shift in energy, the silent judgment, the subtle dismissal. And then, the moment hit her straight in the chest. The salesperson, a slim, red-haired man in his late 30s, wearing a name tag that read Lance, let out a soft chuckle. It was the kind of laugh people used when they thought you didn't belong. Ma'am, Lance said, barely containing his smirk. That piece is from our signature collection. Lucille blinked. And? Lance exhaled dramatically, like he was being forced to explain the obvious. It's one of the most expensive items in our showroom, he said, lowering his voice as if he were letting her in on a private secret. Maybe I could show you something a little more practical? The words landed like a slap. Lucille kept her expression calm, but inside, something simmered. She had seen this game before. A black woman, shopping alone, dressed well, but not draped in designer labels. They saw her and assumed she couldn't afford what they were selling, that she was just here to look, that she was a waste of their time. Lucille had a choice. She could walk away, take her business somewhere else, or she could remind them exactly who they were dealing with. She chose the latter. "I'll take it," she said simply. Lance's smirk froze. For a second he looked genuinely confused, as if she had just spoken in another language. "I'm sorry?" Lucille tilted her head. "Did I stutter?" Lance hesitated, glancing toward the front desk, almost like he was hoping for backup. But before he could say anything, a voice cut through the air like a blade. "Is there a problem here?" Lucille turned. Standing a few feet away was Victoria Lennox, the store manager. Her posture was rigid, her eyes sharp and calculating. Lucille had noticed her earlier, lingering near the checkout counter, watching everything. She had been waiting for a reason to step in, and now she had found one. Victoria walked over slowly, her heels clicking against the polished floor, her expression unreadable. She didn't look at Lucille right away. Instead, she addressed Lance. "Everything all right?" Lance hesitated. "Mrs. O'Neal here is interested in purchasing the Signature Collection sectional." Victoria's eyes flicked to Lucille, scanning her like a human price tag. Then, the faintest hint of a smirk touched her lips. "Mrs. O'Neal," she said smoothly. "That's a rather ambitious purchase." Lucille knew exactly what she meant. She was too old, too black, too unfamiliar to be a real customer in this store. Victoria wasn't just questioning her money, she was questioning her right to be here. Lucille clasped her hands in front of her, keeping her voice steady. "I don't recall asking for your opinion," she said. A few customers stopped browsing nearby, sensing the tension. Victoria's smile didn't falter, but her eyes hardened. "We have a policy," she said, her tone sharp but polite. The kind of tone people used when they didn't want a scene but wanted you gone. "High-ticket items require pre-approval for financing before we proceed with a sale." Lucille's eyebrows lifted. She had just been told to prove she could afford it. She could have let it go. Could have pulled out her black AMEX, dropped it on the counter, and watched their entire world crumble in front of them. But she wanted to see how far they were willing to take this. Lucille tilted her head, feigning curiosity. "And do you make all your customers do that?" Victoria's jaw tightened. Lucille had just called her out, and everyone around them knew it. A couple browsing a nearby dining set exchanged glances, their eyes darting toward the unfolding moment. A young employee standing behind the checkout counter shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing this wasn't going to end well. But Victoria? She doubled down. "We reserve the right to determine who qualifies for purchases at this level," she said smoothly. Lucille let out a slow breath, nodding slightly. There it was. The thing racism rarely said out loud but always made clear. Victoria Lennox had already decided. Lucille didn't belong in this space. She wasn't welcome to spend her money here. She was a nobody in their eyes. Lucille could feel the weight of every set of eyes on her, watching, waiting for her to argue, to defend herself, to make this moment easier to dismiss. Instead, she exhaled softly. Then she smiled, not out of amusement, out of pity. "Thank you for your time," she said, turning toward the door. And just like that, she walked away. Not because she had lost, but because they weren't even worth the fight. For a moment, the store was dead silent. Then, a voice spoke up. A man's voice. Deep, confident, controlled. "I saw everything." Lucille paused mid-step, turning back. A man in his mid-40s, dressed in a navy blue suit, stepped forward from the corner of the store. His presence demanded attention, even before he spoke. Victoria's face drained of color the second she recognized him. "Mr. Carter," she stammered. Lucille's brows furrowed slightly. She had no idea who he was. But Victoria? She definitely did. Nathan Carter, CEO of one of the largest real estate firms in Atlanta. A high-profile client, a man with money, influence, and the power to ruin reputations. And right now, he was watching Victoria Lennox like a predator watches prey. He took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "Tell me something, Victoria," he said, voice smooth but sharp. Would you have spoken to my mother that way? Victoria's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Because the answer was clear. Number Nathan let the silence hang before turning to Lucille. Mrs. O'Neal, he said, his voice full of calm authority. If you still want that sectional, I'd be more than happy to handle the purchase for you. Victoria visibly flinched. Nathan Carter had just taken her power away in front of everyone. Lucille, however, simply smiled. That's kind of you, she said. But I don't give my business to people who don't deserve it. And with that, she walked out. Victoria stood frozen, knowing this wasn't over. Because she had just embarrassed the wrong woman, and the world was about to find out. Nathan Carter had watched it all unfold. He had been standing just a few feet away, flipping through a catalog, when he first noticed the shift in the air. At first, it was subtle. The way the sales staff stiffened when Lucille O'Neal walked in. The way they pretended not to see her. He had seen this before, too many times. And then came the moment that made his stomach tighten with disgust. When the manager, Victoria Lennox, dismissed Lucille like she was nothing. Nathan wasn't just angry. He was disappointed, because people like Victoria, they never learned, until someone made them. Lucille was already at the door when Nathan spoke up. I saw everything. His voice cut through the air like a blade, calm, steady, undeniable. Lucille paused mid-step. Victoria Lennox went rigid. Every employee in the store suddenly froze, as if realizing the situation had just taken a very dangerous turn. Nathan stepped forward, adjusting the cuff of his navy blue suit, his expression unreadable. Victoria found her voice first. Mr. Carter, she said, her tone shifting instantly, from dismissive to overly accommodating. Nathan didn't acknowledge her. His eyes were locked on Lucille. Ma'am, he said, his voice smooth but heavy with meaning. Do you mind if I ask you something? Lucille turned fully now, meeting his gaze. She could tell. He wasn't just another customer. There was authority in the way he stood, power in the way he spoke. Lucille nodded slowly. Go ahead. Nathan exhaled, then turned his attention to Victoria. His eyes weren't angry. They were worse. They were calculating, like he was assessing her worth the way she had just done to Lucille. So tell me, Nathan said, his voice deceptively polite. Is this how you treat all your customers? Victoria's posture stiffened. Excuse me? She said, forcing a laugh. Nathan gestured toward Lucille. This woman walked in, interested in making a purchase, he said. And from the moment she stepped through those doors, you treated her like she didn't belong here. Victoria's lips parted slightly, as if searching for a response. Nathan didn't stop. You ignored her, you dismissed her, and when she wanted to buy your most expensive piece, you suddenly had a policy about pre-approvals? A few nearby customers turned their heads, suddenly very interested in the conversation. Victoria's smile was slipping now. Nathan's expression remained calm, unshaken. But what I really want to know, he continued, is whether you would have said the exact same words to a woman who looked a little more like... He let the sentence hang, unfinished. He didn't have to say it. Everyone in the room already knew. Victoria let out a soft laugh, though it was clear she was struggling to keep control of the situation. Mr. Carter, she said, smoothing her hands down her blazer. I think there's been a misunderstanding. Nathan raised an eyebrow. Is that so? She nodded quickly. I would never treat any customer unfairly, Victoria said, her voice adopting a practiced sincerity. We have policies in place to ensure that all high-value transactions are handled with the utmost professionalism. Nathan smirked. It wasn't a kind smirk. It was the smirk of a man who knew when someone was digging their own grave. So just to be clear, Nathan said, tilting his head, if I walked in here, dressed exactly like she is, and asked to buy that sectional, you'd have told me the same thing? Victoria's jaw tightened. She stopped, because they both knew the answer. And now, so did everyone else in the store. A heavy silence filled the room. A young employee near the register shifted uncomfortably, pretending to be absorbed in paperwork. A middle-aged couple in the corner, clearly wealthy, clearly regulars, watched with undisguised curiosity. Victoria let out a slow breath, her smile faltering. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice lower now. "I assure you this is all a big misunderstanding. If I had realized who Mrs. O'Neal was—" Nathan's expression darkened. "Oh," he said, his voice sharp. "So now it's about who she is?" Victoria froze. She had walked into the trap, and Nathan had let her. "Interesting," Nathan mused, adjusting his cufflinks. "So if she were someone important, she'd deserve respect. But because you assumed she wasn't—" He let the rest of the sentence hang. Victoria's face drained of color. Lance, the red-haired salesman who had started this whole mess, looked like he wanted to disappear. Lucille watched it all unfold with quiet amusement. They had tried to embarrass her. And now, they were the ones who looked small. Victoria took a slow step closer, lowering her voice. "Nathan," she said, her tone shifting from professional to desperate familiarity. "We've always valued your business here. I'd hate for this little mix-up to—" Nathan chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I'm sure you would." Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. Nathan turned back to Lucille. "Mrs. O'Neal," he said smoothly, "if you still want that sectional, I'll personally make sure you're taken care of." A few employees stiffened, realizing what that meant. Nathan Carter was a high-profile client. If he was willing to go against the store's own management, that meant trouble. Victoria's entire posture screamed panic, but she didn't dare interrupt. Lucille, however, simply smiled. It was a calm, knowing smile. A smile that said, "I've won." She turned to Victoria, her voice gentle but firm. "I don't need a favor," Lucille said. "I needed basic respect." Victoria's throat bobbed. Lucille adjusted her coat. "And if you can't give that to every customer who walks through these doors, I don't think this is a place I want to support." Nathan grinned, clearly enjoying how Victoria's power was crumbling by the second. Lucille turned back to him. "But I appreciate the offer," she said warmly. "That was very kind of you." Nathan nodded. "Anytime." And with that, Lucille O'Neal walked out, unbothered, unshaken, undeniably powerful. As the door swung shut behind her, the air in the store remained tense. Victoria stood stone-faced, her nails digging into her palms, realizing the full weight of what had just happened. Lance, the salesman, finally let out a breath, but it didn't make him feel any better. And Nathan? Nathan gave one last look around the room, shaking his head slightly, before he strolled toward the exit. But before he left, he paused, looked back at Victoria, and said, just loud enough for everyone to hear, "You just lost more than a sale today." Then, he walked out, leaving Victoria Lennox standing there, realizing he was absolutely right. Shaquille O'Neal could always tell when something was off with his mother. She was a woman of quiet strength, never one to complain, never one to dwell on what she couldn't change. But tonight, something wasn't right. They were having dinner at one of Lucille's favorite restaurants, a small, family-owned southern spot with warm lighting and the smell of fresh cornbread in the air. Lucille sat across from him, stirring her tea, her expression carefully neutral. To anyone else, she looked fine. But Shaq knew better. She was too quiet. And Lucille O'Neal was never too quiet. Shaq leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You're holding something in," he said. Lucille glanced up, feigning innocence. "Oh?" Shaq nodded. "Yeah. You're stirring your tea like it owes you money." Lucille paused, realizing she had been swirling the spoon in slow, endless circles. She set it down with a small smile. "Boy, stop analyzing me like you're a detective," she said, shaking her head. Shaq smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Ma." His voice was softer now. "What happened?" Lucille exhaled, setting her napkin neatly on her lap. "It's nothing," she said. Shaq's eyes narrowed slightly. His mother never lied, but she sure as hell knew how to downplay things. "Ma," he repeated. "Try again." Lucille sighed, realizing there was no way out of this conversation. "So," she told him, "everything." Shaq didn't interrupt, didn't react right away. He just listened. Listened as his mother told him about Worthington Furniture, about how she walked in ready to buy a sectional, how they dismissed her, how they tried to humiliate her in public. Listened as she explained how a random stranger, Nathan Carter, was the only one to step up. And finally, how she chose to walk away rather than fight a battle that wasn't worth her dignity. When she finished, she lifted her tea and took a small sip, as if she had just recounted a minor inconvenience, not an outright act of discrimination. Shaq's jaw was tight. His fingers clenched into fists under the table. But on the surface, his face was completely calm. Lucille recognized that look. It was the same look he had as a child when he saw a teacher treat his friend unfairly because of his skin color. The same look he had as a teenager when a security guard followed him around a store for no reason. The same look he had when he learned that no amount of wealth could protect you from certain kinds of people. Lucille set her cup down. "Shaquille," she said gently. He finally met her gaze. "Don't," she said. Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Don't what?" Lucille tilted her head slightly. "I know that look." Shaq leaned back, arms crossed. "What look?" Lucille gave him a knowing stare. "The look that means you're about to make a scene." Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. "Ma, I don't need to make a scene." Lucille studied him for a moment. "Then what are you planning?" Shaq smiled. It was a small smile, but it was dangerous. Shaq had never been the kind of man who needed to yell to be heard. His presence was enough. And right now, he had made a decision. He pushed his plate aside, resting his massive hands on the table. "I just got one question," he said. Lucille sighed. "What question?" Shaq tapped his fingers against the wood, his voice still calm, measured. "How many people watched?" Lucille blinked. "What?" Shaq's gaze was sharp, focused. "How many people were in that store when it happened?" Lucille hesitated, then shrugged. "A few, maybe 5 or 6 customers. Some employees." Shaq nodded slowly. "And how many of them said something?" Lucille didn't answer, because they both knew the answer. None. Not one. Not until Nathan Carter stepped in. Shaq exhaled, running a hand over his face. "I just don't get it, Ma." His voice was low, controlled. All these people standing there watching it happen, and no one did anything? Lucille tilted her head. "You really don't get it?" she asked. Shaq was quiet for a moment. Then, he sighed. "No, I do," he admitted. "I just don't want to." Lucille reached across the table, patting his hand. "I know, baby," she said. "But that's the world we live in." Shaq shook his head. "Yeah," he murmured. "But it doesn't have to be." Lucille finished the last sip of her tea and set the cup down. "You know, when I was younger," she said, "I would have fought harder. I would have stood my ground, demanded an apology, told that woman exactly what I thought of her." Shaq smirked. "That's the Lucille O'Neal I know." Lucille chuckled softly. "But I've learned something over the years," she continued. Shaq raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Lucille smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "That sometimes the best way to win is to let them realize who they just disrespected." Shaq sat back, a slow grin spreading across his face. "That's funny," he said. Lucille frowned. "What is?" Shaq lifted his phone, unlocking it with a swipe. "Because I was thinking the same thing." Lucille's eyes narrowed slightly. "What are you up to, Shaquille?" Shaq's grin widened. "Nothing, Ma," he said smoothly. "Just making a couple of calls." Lucille stared at him, knowing that whenever her son said nothing, he meant something. Something big. Something that was going to make waves. She sighed, shaking her head. "You really don't let anything slide, do you?" Shaq smirked. "Not when it comes to you." Lucille exhaled, defeated. "Lord help them," she muttered. Shaq laughed, tucking his phone away. "Oh, they're gonna need it." And just like that, the storm behind his smile was already moving in. Because Shaquille O'Neal didn't need to yell to make a statement. He just had to walk through the right doors. And tomorrow, he was walking into Worthington Furniture, and they weren't ready. The morning air was crisp, the Atlanta sun spilling over the glass-paneled exterior of Worthington Furniture like a spotlight. Inside, The store was pristine, as if nothing had happened the day before. But today, something was about to change, and they had no idea what was coming. Shaquille O'Neal stepped through the entrance without fanfare, without cameras, without his usual larger-than-life presence. Dressed in a fitted black coat, dark jeans, and a plain t-shirt, he wasn't the celebrity today. He was just a customer. At first, no one looked up. The showroom hummed with quiet conversation, the faint scent of polished wood and fresh upholstery lingering in the air. Shaq walked deeper inside, his sharp eyes taking everything in. Then, the shift happened. A young employee behind the front desk caught a glimpse of him. Her eyes widened slightly. Her posture straightened. She whispered something to the salesperson beside her. Within seconds, a ripple spread through the store. Heads turned, expressions changed. And then, Victoria Lennox appeared. She moved quickly, her heels clicking across the showroom floor, her entire demeanor shifting from authority to charm. Victoria's practiced smile was already in place before she even reached him. "Mr. O'Neal," she beamed, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "What a wonderful surprise." Shaq took it, shaking lightly, his own expression unreadable. Victoria was beaming, not with warmth, but with calculated enthusiasm. "Welcome to Worthington Furniture," she continued smoothly. "We are absolutely honored to have you here." Shaq let the moment breathe, his deep voice calm when he finally spoke. "Thanks," he said. "Figured I'd see what all the hype was about." Victoria laughed lightly, a delicate, rehearsed sound. "Well, you've certainly come to the right place," she said. "We pride ourselves on offering only the best for our high-profile clientele." Shaq's lips twitched. He had heard enough. Victoria had no idea who he really was in this moment. To her, he was a rich man with influence, a VIP, a high-value transaction waiting to happen, and that alone made him worthy of her best service. Shaq didn't miss how the employees who had ignored his mother yesterday were now lining up to assist him, their smiles eager, their voices dripping with the kind of respect Lucille had been denied. Funny how that worked. Shaq walked through the showroom, Victoria trailing beside him, guiding him toward their finest pieces like he was royalty. He let them play their game, let them believe they were winning. But in reality, they were walking straight into a trap. Shaq stopped in front of a cream-colored sectional, the same one Lucille had tried to buy. He ran a massive hand over the leather, testing the softness. "Nice," he said casually. "I like this one." Victoria's smile brightened instantly. "Ah, an excellent choice," she gushed. "This is one of our top sellers, imported Italian leather, fully motorized reclining seats. A perfect piece for someone like yourself." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Someone like me?" he repeated. Victoria flinched slightly but recovered fast. "Oh, you know," she said, laughing lightly. "Someone who appreciates quality, someone who, well, truly understands luxury." Shaq nodded slowly. So that was what she was going with. "All right," he said, keeping his voice even. "I'll take it." Victoria clasped her hands together, positively radiating excitement. "Fantastic," she said. "We'll just need to process your purchase." Shaq cut her off with a single look. "I assume you don't need to run a pre-approval first?" he asked. Victoria froze. Her polished mask cracked for just a fraction of a second. Shaq saw it. She tried to recover, forcing another smile. "Oh no, of course not," she said quickly. "That's only for certain." She stopped. Too late. Shaq tilted his head slightly, watching her scramble for an explanation. He had let her play her game. Now? It was his turn. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Employees shifted uncomfortably. A few customers in the showroom glanced over, sensing something was off. Shaq let his voice drop just enough to make sure everyone could hear it. "Yesterday, a woman walked in here," he said. "She looked at this same sectional. She was ready to buy it." Victoria's smile vanished. Shaq kept going. "She wasn't given this service," he said, his tone steady but cutting. "She wasn't treated like a VIP. She wasn't offered your best-selling collection with this much enthusiasm." Victoria's fingers twitched at her sides. Mr. O'Neal, Shaq didn't let her finish. She was told to look at the clearance section, he said flatly. A few gasps sounded nearby. A young couple who had been browsing near the entrance turned fully toward them now. Shaq's voice never rose, but somehow it carried. She was told to prove she could afford it, he continued. She was treated like she was wasting your time. Victoria was pale now, her throat working as she tried to swallow. Shaq let the words settle. Then he went in for the kill. That woman, he said, voice cool as steel, was my mother. The moment the words left his mouth, the entire energy in the store shifted. Victoria's face drained of color. The employees behind her visibly stiffened. The silence was deafening. Shaq took a slow step forward, his towering frame making Victoria seem smaller than ever. I came here today, he said, his voice like thunder before a storm, to see if y'all really treated all your customers the same. Victoria's lips parted, but no words came out. Shaq exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Guess I got my answer. For the first time in her entire career, Victoria Lennox was speechless. The woman who had spent years curating an image of exclusivity, who had mastered the art of knowing exactly who to cater to and who to dismiss, was now completely exposed. And the worst part? Shaquille O'Neal hadn't even raised his voice. He hadn't needed to, because the truth had already done all the damage. Shaq turned toward the young couple near the entrance. The woman, in her mid-30s, expensive designer bag in hand, looked stunned, as if she had just realized how easily it could have been her. Shaq nodded once, then turned back to Victoria. I don't need the sectional, he said, and my mother sure as hell doesn't need an apology. Victoria's breath hitched. Shaq slipped his sunglasses back on, adjusting his coat. But you, he said, voice low. You might need a new job. With that, he turned and walked out, leaving Victoria Lennox standing in the ruins of her own mistake. The silence inside Worthington Furniture was suffocating. For a store designed to be warm and inviting, filled with carefully curated luxury, it suddenly felt cold and exposed, like the moment before a storm. And Shaquille O'Neal was the storm. Victoria Lennox stood frozen, her carefully crafted mask of confidence cracking as Shaq's words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. That woman was my mother. The weight of the sentence sank into the room, deeper than any apology could fix. And for the first time, Victoria had no idea what to say. Shaq had seen many reactions in his life. Shock, disbelief, regret. But the look on Victoria's face right now, it was something else entirely. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was realization. Realization that she had messed with the wrong person. That the woman she had dismissed, humiliated, and shoved toward the clearance section wasn't just another customer. She was Lucille O'Neal. And worse, the entire store had just witnessed her downfall. Lance, the red-haired salesman who had laughed at Lucille the day before, visibly swallowed, his face drained of all color. Jessica, the receptionist, shifted behind the front desk, suddenly very interested in her computer screen, as if she could type her way out of this moment. Even the other customers, the ones who had watched but said nothing the day before, now stood uncomfortably still, casting sideways glances, whispering among themselves. Because now, they cared. Now they understood that what had happened here wasn't just a small misunderstanding. It was blatant, undeniable discrimination. And Shaquille O'Neal had just made sure they would never forget it. Victoria finally found her voice. Mr. O'Neal, She hesitated, swallowing, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were turning white. I sincerely apologize for any miscommunication. If I had known... Shaq's eyebrow lifted. If you had known, he repeated, his deep voice smooth, calm, but carrying the force of something undeniable. Victoria's lips parted slightly, but no words came out, because they both knew exactly what that meant. If she had known Lucille O'Neal was someone important, someone connected, someone with power, she would have treated her differently. And that was the entire problem. The employees behind her suddenly scrambled into action, as if trying to fix the sinking ship before it went completely under. Lance stepped forward, his voice overly eager, falsely cheerful. "Mr. O'Neal, I think there's been a little mix-up," he said, forcing a smile. "We would be more than happy to offer your mother a full VIP shopping experience, completely on the house." Shaq's expression didn't change. "Is that right?" Lance nodded quickly, glancing at Victoria for backup. "Absolutely," he continued. "Whatever she wants, no charge. We deeply value all of our customers." Shaq let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "That's funny," he said, his voice low and even. Lance blinked. What's funny?" Shaq took a slow step forward, towering over him. "What's funny?" he said, his tone measured, controlled, but razor sharp. "Is that yesterday she was just another black woman to y'all." Lance visibly flinched. Shaq turned to Victoria, his gaze steady. "And now," he continued, "now that you realize she has a son who can make noise, who can make sure this place never sees another high-end customer again, you suddenly want to roll out the red carpet?" Victoria opened her mouth, then closed it. Because what could she say? There was no defense, no excuse, no way to talk her way out of this moment. And worst of all, everyone was watching. A murmur rippled through the store. The older couple near the entrance exchanged a look, the kind that said they didn't like what they were hearing, but they couldn't deny it was true. A younger woman, dressed in designer from head to toe, crossed her arms, suddenly looking at Victoria differently. And a teenage girl, who had been scrolling on her phone near the back, lifted it just slightly, angling the camera toward the scene unfolding. Because this was a moment worth remembering. And Shaq? Shaq knew exactly what he was doing. Victoria took a slow breath, regaining her composure just enough to attempt one final play. "Mr. O'Neal," she said, her voice softer now, trying to regain control. "Please, let's not escalate this. We'd like to make this right. Perhaps a private conversation would be better." Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. "A private conversation?" he repeated. Victoria nodded, clearly desperate to contain the damage. "Yes," she said quickly. "Let's discuss this somewhere more." Shaq cut her off with one devastating question. "Would you have said that to her?" Victoria blinked. I'm sorry?" Shaq's voice was calm, steady. "If she had been standing here, instead of me," he said, tilting his head, "would you have asked her for a private conversation? Would you have tried to make it right?" The silence was deafening. Victoria didn't answer. Because she couldn't. And that was the loudest response of all. Shaq exhaled slowly, letting the weight of the moment sink into the room. Then he took a step back. "Keep your discounts," he said. "Keep your free offers. She doesn't need them." Victoria looked like she wanted to disappear. Shaq turned toward the front entrance. Then, just before walking out, he glanced over his shoulder. And in a voice so calm, so low, so utterly undeniable, he said, "You remember this moment." Victoria's breath hitched. The entire store felt smaller. Shaq slipped his sunglasses back on. Then, with a final nod to the stunned employees and watching customers, he walked out, and the doors closed behind him. The moment he was gone, the tension inside Worthington Furniture erupted into a quiet storm. Employees looked at each other, trying to process what had just happened. Customers murmured, some in shock, some in quiet approval, some already typing out tweets about what they had just witnessed. And Victoria Lennox? She just stood there, silent, knowing one thing for certain. She had just lost a lot more than a sale. She had lost the one thing money couldn't buy back, her reputation. And worse, Shaquille O'Neal had made sure the world would never forget it. The morning after Shaquille O'Neal walked out of Worthington Furniture, the world woke up to a storm. Not the kind that rattled windows or flooded streets. This was the kind that couldn't be ignored, because when someone like Shaq speaks, people listen. It started with a single tweet, a blurry but unmistakable video clip. Shaq standing in the middle of Worthington Furniture, his voice calm but cutting, exposing the way his mother had been dismissed, ignored and judged before she even had the chance to speak. The caption was simple. They treated her like she was nothing, until they realized she was Shaq's mom. But what about the people they do this to every day? And just like that, the conversation exploded. Within hours, social media was on fire. The video racked up millions of views, spreading across Twitter, Instagram, and news outlets faster than anyone at Worthington could control. People who had never heard of Victoria Lennox before were saying her name now, and not in a way she'd ever wanted. Black luxury matters started trending. Do you see it flooded feeds? Stories poured in. People who had been treated the same way. People who had been steered toward budget-friendly options. People who had been asked, in that same polite but dismissive tone, if they were just looking. And before Worthington Furniture could even release a statement, the headlines had already taken over. Shaquille O'Neal calls out racial bias in high-end retail. How many others have been turned away? The quiet racism of luxury shopping. It's not just one store, it's a pattern. Shaq had never raised his voice, but now the whole world was speaking for him. She had spent the last 24 hours in damage control, calling executives, drafting apologies, trying to put out fires she had started herself. But no PR statement could fix what had happened, because this wasn't just about Lucille O'Neal anymore. It was about every person Worthington Furniture had ever dismissed, every customer they had ever judged. And Victoria? She was the face of it now. She had spent years curating an image of exclusivity. And now? Now that very exclusivity was being exposed for what it really was. He could have let it go. Could have walked away. Let the headlines run their course. Let Worthington scramble to clean up their mess. But that wasn't enough. Not for him. Not for his mother. Not for the people who would walk into stores just like Worthington tomorrow and be treated the same way. So Shaq made some calls. Not to lawyers, not to PR firms, to the people who actually mattered. When the reporters came knocking, asking if he wanted to sue, if he wanted a formal apology, if he wanted reparations, Shaq just shook his head. That's not what this is about. They pressed him. So what do you want? Shaq leaned forward, looking directly into the camera. I want them to understand that this isn't just about my mom. This is about all the people who don't have a son like me to stand up for them. And just like that, the conversation shifted. Within days, Worthington Furniture wasn't the only name being dragged into the light. Other high-end brands, luxury retailers, elite boutiques, high-status hotels, started feeling the pressure. Customers started sharing their own experiences. Names were named, receipts were posted. And before the week was over, something unprecedented happened. Change. Luxury brands rushed to release statements, but this time it wasn't just about PR, because people weren't buying empty apologies anymore. So they had to do something real. It wasn't just about hiring a few more black employees. It wasn't about putting out one-time sensitivity courses. It was about actually changing how these businesses operated, how they trained their staff, how they made decisions about who got treated like a priority and who got ignored, and most importantly, how they held themselves accountable. Major retailers announced new leadership roles for inclusivity. High-end fashion brands partnered with black-owned businesses to reshape their marketing. And luxury department stores? They implemented mystery shopper programs to test their own employees, because now they knew people were watching. A week after the incident, Victoria Lennox was forced to step down. The store issued an official statement, calling her departure a necessary step toward a more inclusive future. But the damage? It was already done. Because Victoria Lennox had been exposed as a symptom of a bigger problem. And no matter how fast they tried to scrub her name from the headlines, people weren't forgetting. Because now, the world had seen how it happens. How people like Victoria uphold systems of exclusion without even realizing it. How silence makes them complicit. And how, for the first time, someone like her had been held accountable in real time. Shaq could have destroyed Worthington Furniture. He could have sued them into the ground. He could have used his influence to make sure no celebrity, no athlete, no person of status ever set foot in that store again. But instead, he let his mother's example lead the way. Lucille O'Neal had never needed revenge. She had never needed anyone to beg for her forgiveness. She had walked out of that store with her dignity intact because she had always known one thing: her worth was never theirs to decide. And now, the world knew it too. This wasn't about one incident. It wasn't about one store. It was about an entire industry learning a lesson they could no longer ignore. Because now, People were watching. They were paying attention. And most importantly, they weren't going to let it happen again. Because respect wasn't a privilege. It was the standard. The headlines faded. The social media firestorm slowed. The world, as it always did, moved on to the next big thing. But for Worthington Furniture, the lesson wasn't over. Because some moments don't just pass. They change everything. 2 weeks after Shaq walked out of Worthington Furniture, the company made a formal announcement. Victoria Lennox was gone. No quiet resignation. No promotion to an unseen role. No graceful exit. She had been removed. A clear sign that the company wasn't just trying to save face. They were trying to survive. In her place, the company brought in a new chief of client relations, Karen Mitchell, a respected advocate for diversity in the luxury retail space. She wasted no time. Store policies were rewritten. New hiring and training procedures were launched. Every employee, from the floor staff to the boardroom, had to complete racial bias and inclusivity training. Not a one-time seminar, but an ongoing program. And the most important change? A zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior. Because if Worthington Furniture wanted to survive in the new world Shaq had just created, they had to prove that their lesson wasn't just a PR stunt. He hadn't exposed one store just to let another take its place. So, while Worthington scrambled to rebuild its reputation, Shaq focused on something bigger. He partnered with Black-owned luxury retailers, putting a spotlight on businesses that had always welcomed customers with dignity, not judgment. He funded scholarships for young Black entrepreneurs trying to break into the retail and fashion industry. And he worked with high-end brands to launch a national campaign, one that didn't just talk about diversity, but actively built a more inclusive future. Shaq had always been known for his generosity. But this time, he wasn't just giving away money. He was changing an industry. It had never been about the furniture. It had never been about Victoria Lennox or Worthington's policies. It was about what people believed when they looked at someone like her. About the assumptions that ran deeper than price tags or store policies. And sitting across from her son in the soft glow of her home, she saw the change in his eyes. This time, it wasn't just about fixing what had happened to her. It was about fixing what had been happening for decades. And that was worth more than any victory. Shaq leaned back in his chair, stretching his massive arms. "You know," he said, "you never did get that couch." Lucille laughed, shaking her head. "Boy, after all that, I don't even want it anymore." Shaq smirked. "That's a shame. I bought one just like it." Lucille raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" Shaq's grin widened. "Yeah, except I didn't buy it from Worthington." Lucille chuckled, nodding in approval. "You always were a smart one," she said. Shaq tilted his head. "Got it from a Black-owned furniture company. They delivered it with a handwritten note thanking us for our support." Lucille's smile softened. "See?" she said. "That's how you build something real." Shaq nodded, his voice quieter now. "Yeah," he said. "That's how you change the world." Lucille sipped her tea, watching her son in the glow of the evening light. She had always known his strength wasn't just in his size. It was in his heart, in his ability to take a moment of pain and turn it into something powerful. And as she set her cup down, she said something that would stay with Shaq forever. "People like that manager," she said. "They build their world thinking people like us will always be small." She looked up, her eyes warm but sharp. "But the thing about respect?" Shaq waited. Lucille smiled. "You can't take it from someone who never needed your approval in the first place." Lucille and Shaq sat there, the quiet wrapping around them. 2 generations of strength woven into one moment. The world had tried to make Lucille feel small. They had failed. Because her son had made sure they would never forget her name. And more importantly, they would never do it again. Some moments expose more than just one store. They expose a system. How many times has this happened when no one was watching? Change doesn't come from silence. It comes from calling it out, from holding people accountable, from making sure they never do it again. The question isn't if this will happen again. The question is, who's paying attention when it does?